Good morning, this is Environmental Intelligence Episode 8 for March 10th, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental regulatory science and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. BC's proposed FOI amendments could restrict access to EMA and CSR records, requiring immediate advocacy before legislative passage. British Columbia's new bill introduces potential barriers to freedom of information requests, directly affecting access to contaminated sites data under EMA and CSR for multi-jurisdictional consultants. U.S. proposals to weaken vessel speed limits for North Atlantic right whales may pressure harmonization with Canada's Fisheries Act and SARA protections in Atlantic provinces. Professionals should monitor BC legislative debates this week and review cross-border species risk assessments for offshore projects. Let's dive into the lead story out of British Columbia. The provincial government is facing pushback on a new bill that would expand exemptions and fees under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, specifically targeting public records like environmental compliance documents under the Environmental Management Act and contaminated sites regulation. Up until now, FOI requests have been a straightforward way to pull site registry data, spill reports, and remediation certificates without breaking the bank, essential for due diligence in Phase 1 ESAs or risk assessments. These amendments introduce broader cabinet confidence exemptions and steeper processing fees, which could delay or outright deny access to those records. For those of us working contaminated sites in BC, this hits hard. Think about pulling EMA Section 49 certificates or CSR Protocol 1 inputs for risk assessments. Timelines stretch, costs climb, especially on projects overlapping with Alberta's EPA in oil sands areas. I've seen teams rely on these records to flag historical spills or remediation histories. Without them, you're flying blind on interprovincial due diligence. Compare that to Ontario's more transparent setup under the EPA, where record access doesn't come with these hurdles. Cross-jurisdictional teams might lean there to mitigate. What I find interesting here is the timing. This comes amid rising scrutiny on contaminated sites transparency, potentially signaling a broader pullback on public data. Opposition amendments could soften it during second reading this month, with an effective date possibly by Q2 2026. If you're affected, get feedback to BC's Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner by March 31st. Don't wait, as this could reshape how we handle Phase 2 assessments or compliance audits province-wide. Shifting to regulatory and policy watch, starting in Ontario. According to the Narwhal, the Cemetery, Crematorium and Funeral Services Act, overseen by the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, is creating barriers for natural burials, things like soil quality assessments that could trigger EPAO, Reg 15304 site investigations for contaminants. In practice, this means consultants might need to roll out Phase 1 or 2 ESAs to confirm compliance with CCME soil guidelines, bumping up costs and timelines for any proposed burial sites. If you're advising on land use changes in Ontario, review those site-specific risk assessments now, especially since municipal approvals often demand completion within 90 days of application. On the U.S. side, GRIST reports proposals to weaken vessel speed limits under the Endangered Species Act for North Atlantic right whales, which could ripple into Canadian waters. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we're already enforcing 10-knot seasonal limits under Fisheries Act Section 7 and SARA critical habitat protections. This matters for offshore energy and shipping in Atlantic provinces. Expect pressure to update impact assessments under the federal IAA for cross-border alignment. Keep an eye on NOAA consultations closing April 15, 2026. Any harmonized threshold changes could tighten your navigation risk models. Staying with U.S. developments, GRIST notes a federal withdrawal of $1.5 billion in tribal clean energy funding under the Inflation Reduction Act. This parallels Indigenous-led projects in Canada under CEPA and IAA, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan mining areas, where we're seeing shifts in support for renewable transitions. For us, it signals potential delays in adopting PFAS-free remediation tech amid interprovincial carbon pricing harmonization. No hard deadlines yet, but track Natural Resources Canada consultations for equivalent programs. Reduced funding could slow your tech integrations. Finally, in this section, Inside Climate News covers cuts to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service budgets, delaying recoveries like the Florida panther. This echoes Canada's SARA delays in species at risk assessments for habitats in BC and Ontario. Expect tighter federal-provincial overlaps under the Fisheries Act for cross-border pollutants, influencing CCME risk frameworks. Watch for US ESA amendments that might push Canadian updates by end 2026. could mean revisiting your biodiversity integrations and remediation plans. In science and technical updates, let's spotlight practice prep for spring groundwater monitoring as Q2 field season nears. Make sure your ISO 117025 accredited labs are calibrated for PFAS analysis using EPA method mixtine-33 equivalents, hitting detection limits below 0.005 micrograms per liter to align with BC CSR and Ontario O-Reg 15304 thresholds. Prioritize in-situ methods like permeable reactive barriers for volatile organic sites and fold-in climate adaptation for flood-prone areas per CCME guidelines. For coastal assessments in Atlantic provinces, update sampling protocols with sea level rise projections. It's routine, but skipping it now means rework later. From Science Daily, the Alnachetri serapalisiensis fossil out of Argentina shows evolutionary miniaturization in alvarezsaurs, a 2-pound specimen highlighting adaptive traits. This ties into paleontological site assessments in fossil-rich Alberta under EPA heritage protections, especially where they overlap contaminated sites. Key takeaway: it could trigger additional IAA reviews, so reference CCME guidelines when integrating biodiversity into your remediation designs. Nothing groundbreaking, but it reinforces why we layer those protections in. Another from Science Daily. Researchers found retrotransposon-derived centromeres in yeast, shedding light on genomic stability. For bioremediation under CEPA, this suggests microbial attenuation could transform junk DNA into functional elements, boosting efficacy in monitored natural attenuation. They report 20 to 30% improved degradation rates for hydrocarbons in Alberta oil sands sites. Align that with BC CSR Protocol 13 for risk-based closures. What this signals is potential for more efficient proposals. I've used similar insights to shave timelines on EPA approvals. Turning to industry and practice notes, CBC reports the Port of Vancouver hit record cargo of 170.4 million tons, fueled by grain, oil, and potash exports. This ramps up environmental management under federal CPA and BC EMA for spill risks and air emissions. If you're handling port-adjacent sites, update your pump and treat designs for hydrocarbon contamination. Costs could rise 10 to 15% with the traffic surge. Tie it into annual compliance reporting for IAA-assessed infrastructure. It's a reminder that throughput spikes mean tighter monitoring. Inside Climate News highlights the shuttering of bank accounts for environmental defenders in Ecuador, signaling risks for international projects. This is relevant to Canadian mining firms under CEPA's extraterritorial provisions in Saskatchewan and Alberta. It calls for enhanced social risk assessments in your remediation contracts. Due diligence on supply chains just got more layered. Monitor how this influences federal SARA consultations. Could add scrutiny to your overseas ties. And from CBC, the firing of a Canadian Coast Guard captain for ignoring distress calls underscores Fisheries Act Section 36 duties on pollution prevention in maritime zones. This impacts spill response planning in PEI and Atlantic provinces. Verify those emergency protocols in your environmental management plans now, with CPA penalties up to $1 million for non-compliance. Update field team training this quarter. It's dry stuff, but ignoring it is how fines happen. For action items today, if you're working contaminated sites in BC, review the proposed FOI bill for impacts on accessing CSR site profiles and EMA spill data, and submit comments to the Privacy Commissioner by March 31st. For Atlantic offshore projects, update risk assessments to incorporate potential U.S. whale speed limit changes, cross-referencing SARA habitat maps. If handling Ontario burial site proposals, assess under EPAO. Regdino 15304 and initiate Phase 1 ESAs for any client inquiries this week. Brief your teams on U.S. tribal funding cuts, comparing to Canadian CPA incentives for Indigenous clean energy in remediation designs. And integrate those new yeast genomic insights into bioremediation proposals for hydrocarbon sites, targeting Alberta EPA approvals. Looking at the week ahead, March 15th marks the close of federal CPA consultations on PFAS substance list updates, which will affect national thresholds and your lab methods. March 20th is Alberta's EPEA annual reporting deadline for Tier 1 contaminated sites, so get those remediation progress submissions under CCME standards in. On March 25th, BC's CSR Protocol 6 review period ends, potentially amending vapor intrusion modeling for urban sites. And March 31st is Ontario's EPA public input deadline on climate adaptation guidelines, including flood risk mapping for contaminated lands. Mark your calendars. Before we wrap, Tomorrow, watch for more on the evolving PFAS thresholds as CP consultations wind down, with implications for your Q2 sampling plans. That's Environmental Intelligence for March 10th, 2026. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day.